Right. So the first recorder that I started on this project, I got cut off abruptly. So I didn't quite get to finish that first part. But just to recap, we're just building a CLI application that makes use of an API to get external data. And as far as this point, what we've accomplished, we've got our general project structure. We've got a bid file that we created. We've got classes for each of our models. We've got an API model that deals with handling our API. We've got our CLI class, which handles input to and from the user. And we've got a drink model that handles all the logic related to making our drinks. So for this project, the idea is just that we greet our user, we ask them to pick a specific ingredient to make drinks. We go to our API and get information related to that query, right? So we're going to return all the drinks that have that ingredient. We print all the drinks that we have, and I think that's about where we left off. So we can go ahead and run our executable, Ruby bin drinks, and I think we left off at that point where we can just print the data for those drinks that have that ingredient. And again, a lot of what's tricky about starting a project is how to flesh it out as you go. So we've been emphasizing sort of like, what is the end goal? What do we ultimately want to accomplish? Then we build that piece, then we kind of pause and make sure everything is working as expected. So you see it's very slow. And ultimately what our next goal is going to be, like this is the functionality that we're going for. We display our list of drinks to the user, and then we ask them to pick a specific one to get more information about. So something like, hey, choose one of these drinks that you'd like to get more details for, and then we kind of repeat that process of grabbing their input and deciding what to do from there. And this is why we also, in our drink model, we store the drink ID, because that's going to be helpful when we hit our API again to get information just for that one specific drink. All right, still not running, huh? I don't think we should be in a loop or anything like that. We can start building out the next piece. So the next endpoint that we're going to hit, you see we talked about this API last time. There's a few different endpoints or URL addresses that you can input, and then you get data back from the API about that specific query. So we've already used the search by ingredient endpoint, where we can let the user pick which ingredient they want drinks for, and then they get data about drinks that have that ingredient. Our next step is we want to be able to search drinks by ID. I think it's this guy. So we're looking up full cocktail details by ID. That's the next endpoint we're going to hit. Still not able to get this guy to run. What if I kill that and try again? Shouldn't have an infinite loop. We're going through our drinks. We're printing them. Should be all set. So what we're going to do here is use this API to look up by ID. This is just an example, right? This value here will be dynamic in our application, so we'll inject the specific ID of the drink that we're looking for. But again, the idea is that when we hit these endpoints, we get back this JSON data that we can then consume or use in our application. So when we put in an ID of a drink, we get back the data for that specific drink. There are a bunch of different attributes here we could choose to use or not use in our application. What I'm going to focus on here is just one, the instructions for the drink or the recipe for getting it. And that's why in our drink model, I added this adder accessor for the instructions. Okay, so finally, it looks like our application is working. We said that this is sort of the functionality we built so far. where we can enter an ingredient. We get back a list of drinks with that ingredient. Right? So that seems to be working well so far. Now we're just working on that next piece. So thinking back to our CLI, we kind of have a good flow so far, right? But now we sort of have to repeat the process. We want to prompt the user again and ask them to give us some input on what drink they'd like to see more information for. I'm going to go ahead and extract this into a method. So I want to be able to say something like prompt user, and then call a method that sort of handles that prompting for me. So I'm going to go ahead and define that below our print drinks. Okay. So just a simple instance method that prompts the user. And we can say something like, select a number to see the, let's say, instructions for a drink. And then we want to handle the other options as well, because the idea is that this piece is, like, we want it to be flexible. At any point in your CLI, you want the user to have some options and not be locked into just kind of going through it one way. So we're going to say select a number to see the instructions for a drink, type list to see the list again, ingredient, this we're going to implement later, to select a new ingredient, or exit to exit, right? So the idea is that the user has a few different options at this point. We're just reminding them of what those options are. So they can see the instructions for their drink in normal flow of the application, or maybe they want to go back and see that list again, or maybe they want to do something different, or maybe they just want to get out, they're done with it. I'm going to add a little formatting in here just to make it look nicer. But now we can go ahead and prompt the user, right? And again, now we got to get some input back from them, right? So we use gets to do that. So we can say something like input gets.strip.count case. So like we said last time, you want to sort of treat your user like they're built upside down and they might make mistakes using your application. So we're just going to validate that we get rid of any white space they might have entered, and we're going to down case just so that we know the exact case of the data that we're getting back. And we don't have to account for that elsewhere. So then here we get the data from the user. And we want to, what do we want to do next? Do we want to handle the API? I think what I want to do is to start building out the menuing loop, right, in this CLI, right? Because the idea is that we want it to keep responding to user feedback. So a pattern that you'll often see is seeing some kind of loop implemented inside of your CLI. So we want to prompt the user, we want to get their input, and then we can start our looping. I'm going to use a while loop, but there are a ton of correct ways you could do this. While loops just make a little more sense to me semantically than like until loops, for example. So we can say something like, while the input that's given by the user is not equal to exit, okay, do some other stuff. Right, and the idea is that when they type exit, they want out. We want to be able to implement that pretty seamlessly. It's also nice when you're testing because it's a little more elegant as far as exiting your application versus like a Control-C. But as long as what they're giving us is an exit, we're going to implement some looping behavior, right? So we could say something like, if the input that's given to us is equal to list, we're going to go ahead and say, go ahead and list my drinks with this ingredient again, right? So it's just like we're going to go backwards. We're going to list again. And then here we have to account for our data type. List is going to be a string. Cool, right? So that's one case, right? We're also going to handle, hey, what if they actually pick an ingredient again here? And I think this we're going to, oh, I see. We're picking a drink, not an ingredient. So we say, hey, if the user picks an ingredient, we want to go ahead, sorry, this should be a drink actually, a drink. Go ahead and get the details for that drink. And then we might do something like print those drink details. Then we want to say, hey, if we put in another ingredient, so like say they want to go back and check out a different ingredient, say else if user picks another drink, we're going to do some other stuff. We'll implement this next time. And then finally, right, again, you want to validate for your user, not using your application the way that you anticipated. So let's say they put in something that doesn't match any of these, right? Their cat hit their keyboard, they got some wonky string they entered. We want to be able to say something like, hey, I don't understand, let's try again. So we're going to say, I do not understand, please try again. And then maybe outside of our if block, we go ahead and repeat that process. So we try prompting the user again because we didn't get what happened here. And we say, hey, knucklehead, try again. Give me something meaningful I can work with. So we repeat that getting of the user input, right? And again, because we have this in a loop, like once we grab that input again, it's just going to repeat and like check to see, hey, what did they enter? What do I do next? Right? So this is our control flow. And then outside of our loop, right, we only end up out of here if the user enters exit, right, because that's the condition of our loop. So if they have entered exit, we want to exit gracefully, just something small, maybe a little bit of formatting, and you say something like put bye, or like thanks for using my application, something along those lines, right? So I think we have a good idea of where we want to go here. We have a basic structure for our menuing loop. Now, at this point, we're going to handle the case where the user picks a drink, right? We're sort of getting to the point here where we kind of need some functionality to go ahead and get a drink by its ingredient. Okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to head on over to our drink model, and we're just going to implement a pretty standard find by. Right? So this is a class finder. It's got to be a class method. We're going to say find by ingredient. Okay? That's going to take in an ingredient as an argument. Okay? And then we're going to say what? Hey, look through all of my drinks. Right? And then here, I guess probably would have been nice to call this something about like select by, because we're not just getting the first drink with that ingredient, we're getting all drinks that have that. So probably might be more semantic to call this select by. So we're going to look through all of our drinks, right? That we can expose through a method. So we could either do add all, or we're going to call our method here. We're going to say, hey, select all of the drinks that have this current ingredient, right? We know select is a smarter iterator than each, so it's designed to take a condition and to return an array of all the items that match that condition. So we're going to go ahead, this is going to be a drink object or a drink. We're going to say, hey, is this drink ingredient, right? Because we added that as a model, or sorry, as an adder accessor, an attribute on our drink model. We're going to say, hey, is its ingredient the same as the ingredient we're passing into this method, right? So just kind of thinking ahead to the functionality we're kind of building here. So then if we head back over to our CLI, I probably want to adjust a couple of things here. So the one thing is I need a drink to be born knowing it has an ingredient. I think we don't have that implemented yet. We've just got the name and the drink ID. So I'm going to adjust that in a couple places. We're going to say, hey, an ingredient is born knowing that it has an ingredient. And I'm going to pass that into our initialize as well with a keyword argument, ingredient. Cool. And then we said in our API is where we were making our drinks. And we're just going to update that to take in the ingredient, which we passed in here in our get drinks method. So I'm going to say ingredient is ingredient. Okay, cool. We have what we need there. We have our select. That looks good. So then if we're thinking back to our CLI, the idea, I see, we're going to do this bit first. So the idea is that we want to be able to list all drinks with this particular ingredient. So that's where we're going to make use of our select by. We already have a method that lists drinks for us. That's our print drinks. So I'm going to go ahead and call that again here. But then instead of passing in all the drinks here, this is where we're going to make use of our class finder that we just built. So we could do this in one line or two. It doesn't really matter, but we could do something like drinks equals drink dot select by ingredient. Okay. And then we can pass in that ingredient that we stored as an instance variable. Right. So we're saying, hey, if the user wants to see the list of drinks again, go ahead and call that class finder, right? Get the drinks that have that ingredient, and then just print the ones that they're asking to see again. And then we can always test that out as we go along. It might break elsewhere, but we'll see. It doesn't like my empty statements. That's all right. So we can kind of test this a bit more later as we go along. We just have a bunch of pseudocode here that hasn't been built out fully yet. Let's work on, actually, we can get rid of this guy here, so we're not building that till next time. And then here, we want to say, hey, if the user picks a drink, go ahead and get the details for that drink. So at a high level, we need to be able to do a couple things here. We need to know that their input actually relates to an available drink. We need to be able to find the information for the drink that they'd like to see more about. And we need a way to kind of incorporate that into our API. So first, as far as the actual validation here, like how do we know that a user has picked something that we can actually give to them? Well, we know that essentially we're listing out a list of drinks with that ingredient. It's going to have a certain length. So a common pattern you'll see is that you're taking the input and seeing, hey, is this between 1 and, say, the length of that list, right? So we want to make sure that first they've got a valid input. So we can say, hey, if I take this input, which is a string, if I convert it to an integer, right, that integer has to be between 1 and the length of our array, right? So say we're listing 5 drinks to them, they can only pick 1 through 5. So there's a few different ways that we can implement this. Maybe something like between would work nice here, but I'm just going to kind of build it simply and say, hey, we want that input to be greater than 0. And we also want it to be less than the length of our drinks array. Less than drinks dot length. Okay, cool. And I think here, okay, this works because we're not repeating ourselves. So we're going back. So this should be fine. Okay. And then once we've validated that, like, hey, they've actually picked something valid to work with, we need to go ahead and get the details for that drink. Right. So this is where we might like to have something like, I guess there's a few different ways we can do this. We can do a specific class finder for one drink, but here we're just going to make use of that select by that we already built. We're going to say something like, hey, this current drink, right, is going to be stored in that array that's returned from our select by. So it's going to be in that drinks array. And we're going to take the input from our user and subtract by 1, right? Because if they pick drink number 1, that's really going to be the first drink in our drinks array. right? And we know array start at 0. So we're going to say, hey, take their input, make sure it's an integer, and then subtract 1 from it, right? So we're just getting the current drink from our array of drinks that we pulled above, right? Now that we have an actual drink object, we're going to want to be able to go and hit our API for the other details that we want for that drink. So again, this is kind of a means of us like writing the code that we wish that we had. So I'm envisioning, hey, my API is what handles these API calls. So I want to have a method called something like get drink details, right? Because it's going out and it's getting the details for that specific drink. So we're going to call it get drink details. Okay, and it needs to know which drink that we're talking about, so we're going to pass it that object, right? So this is a method that we still need to build, right? But we're just kind of envisioning like, hey, what do we want to happen next? All right, so we're going to head on over to our API and build that for us. All right, so again, that's a class method. What did I call it? Get drink details. Let's see, I'm not making it up when I say that this is really slow. Okay, so we're going to pass in the drink here, actually. Right? So then the idea is like, hey, what do I want to do here? I need a URL, so I need to know what my endpoint is. And that's going to be what we looked at before. What is my endpoint? And that's going to be in this structure that we pulled. So then we'll follow a similar pattern to last time where we say, hey, the URL that we're going for, our endpoint, follows this generic structure, right? So there's my endpoint. How do I go there and get what I need? How do I parse the response? And then what do I want to do from there? Right? So just like we saw with our first example, we're working with the dynamic part of that endpoint. So we don't want to use this specific drink ID every time. What we're going to do is we're going to pull it from the drink object that's passed in, right? So this is why in our drink model, we set that drink ID. So we're going to go ahead and say, hey, use this specific pattern, but actually interpolate the ID of the drink I want to know more about, right? So then we're going to hit our URL. And then just like we did before, we actually could probably copy paste this. We're going to say, hey, right? This method is going to go out and hit our API, return a response for us. We can respond to it in a similar fashion as we did before. I think I'm just going to hop in pry here and make sure that it's structured in the way I'm anticipating. And then I think it should run now because we fixed our other issue from before. So let's say we pick a different ingredient like honey, right? We get our list of drinks back. So that looks pretty good so far. And then here, if we want to test out some of our other functionality from before, we said, hey, if we type in list, we get our list back, and then the prompt repeats. We're not going to exit for right now. We're going to pick a number. So let's say we go with honeybee. We should hit our pry unless we've broken something. Okay, cool. So better late than never. We've got our response, right? We said from last time, we're just getting back this long, like, series of strings, right? Anything across the internet has to be sent as strings. So then we can go ahead and we can parse that response like we talked about last time. So we could say something like, hey, JSON gem, go ahead and parse this response and give us some meaningful JSON that we can then work with, right? So we see we get that return, right? Here is a nice object. It looks like we still have that high level key of drinks that we have to go through like we did last time. So if we wanted to grab the actual drink, for example, it'd probably be something like drinks, cool, and that should be just one item. Yep, perfect. Cool. So we're just going to translate that over. Just going to copy paste actually for ease. We're going to call this singular drink though. Right. So that's how we grab the data for our particular specific drink. Cool. And then we said we're just going to use one attribute here. If we look at our drink object here, we should be able to pull the instructions using this string instructions key. So just something like string instructions. And then just make sure to close that properly. Okay, got an extra bracket. Cool. Drinks. I think we have to specify the element. There we go. Okay, yeah, just because this returns an array, we're grabbing the first item. There is only one, and then we're calling that key on it. I'm going to use first here, actually, as it reads a little nicer, maybe. Dot first. That'll do. Cool. I don't want to set it this way, though. What I want to do is say, hey, this existing drink object, can I set its instructions? Okay, so we've got, okay. So we're going to take care of our naming here. I did a bad thing. This here, this is our drink object that's being passed in, whereas this is just some JSON data that's being returned. So I'm going to call this something like drink details, so I'm not conflating the two. What I'm going to do next here is I'm going to add an attribute on my existing drink object here, right? So that's our next step. We went out and we hit our API, we got a response, we parsed it, so now we've got some JSON. Now we're going to use it to update our existing drink. Because remember, we already have the drinks with this particular ingredient. They're being stored in our model, right? They're in all. We don't want to have to like make new drinks every time we add information. We want to find the existing drink, right? And then just update it. So here we know which drink we're looking at because we passed it in. And we're going to say, hey, for this particular drink, I'm going to set its instructions because I set that as a model on drink. Let me actually just make sure that's spelled right. That looks good. So we're going to say update those instructions to be, let's say drink details, specifically that string instructions, right? That's how we pulled it when we were in Pry. We could have just done that here and then we can just pass drink details, but I think this is a little bit clearer and it's also more flexible if you ultimately decide that you wanted to add more attributes from that JSON. So we grab all the attributes first and then pull the specific one that we want to set the instructions. I think I'm missing one piece. Just like we saw before, we're going to get back an array here. We have to pull the actual piece that we want. And then I think we should be good. Let's just check and make sure we're all right. Okay, cool. We're going to keep with honey. We want that first guy. And then something is broken. Length, undefined method length for no class. That's in our drinks, line 6. Well, no, that's here. This drink, line 6 in main. Well, that's just because it's breaking here. That's not very helpful. But somewhere we're calling length. It's probably in our CLI. Think I see. So essentially what's happening is we made a bad assumption, right? We're grabbing the drinks here, but we only have access to it when the user types in list. So I thought I could reuse that variable for my condition here, which is not the case because it's only set when this condition is met. So as much as it pains me, I'm just going to repeat myself here a little bit, and we can always come back and refactor as we need to. But we're just going to go ahead and search again. So yeah, that's probably the best course of action for right now. And then now we actually will get an array back that we could then call length on. Cool. We've got honey. We're going to look at the first guy. Well, we get a new error at least. This is pointing to our CLI, line 23. Because we have to kind of go through and follow that pattern. Oh man, this makes me twitchy, guys. All this repetition. But again, we can always come back and fix it later if it makes sense too. Okay, cool. Now it's trying. Okay, cool. So we have more success here. And again, this is why it's so important to kind of poke around and make sure it's working as you think as you go along. Otherwise, you could you might find that it's broken in multiple places, and now it's very tricky to figure out sort of where things are happening. So now we're in our pry. I just want to see my drink. It looks how I want. It's got its instructions set. We could probably handle this formatting stuff later, but I think for right now we're good to go. Now, one thing, okay, so I didn't exit properly, but now if I type an exit, my CLI will respond, right? It says, hey, bye. Cool. So I think, so what do we got? We can get our drink details, and then what do we want to do? We want to actually go through and like print the details for that drink, right? So if I think about the functionality that I'm going for, I want to be able to say something like, hey, here's my drink, and maybe let's call this something like, I guess this is okay, because we already have the drink stored in a variable. So we might have something like print drink, right? Because I already have the drink that I want, right? I've gotten its details and updated its instructions attribute. I want to be able to say like, hey, now that I have that drink, go ahead and print its details. So I can pass in that drink and call this other method that we haven't built yet. I'm going to go ahead and add that now. Okay. I'm just going to put it right underneath this other print one. Print drink and pass in our drink object, right? And then the formatting of this can vary, whatever you'd like to build, but we want to say ultimately something like, hey, here's the name of our drink, and here are our instructions, because that's what we said we would give back to you, right? We'd send the instructions for the drink. So put drink.name, put drink.instructions. Okay, then we've got our little helper here. I think that should be good. And now we're just going to repeat. Like, did that do what we thought? Is it going to break? Do we want to tweak the functionality? We're going to keep with honey. Right, maybe we pick number 2 now. Right, it's waiting. We hit our pry. We're just going to exit out of that. And then, lo and behold, we get the name of our drink. Right, that was the second one here, Melia. And then we get some instructions. That's formatted a little bit ugly, which isn't the end of the world. We can always tweak that part, but like we have a functioning application that will then give them their drink ingredient, right? And now whatever they want to do from here, they can. They can list again, that still works, right? They can pick a new drink. We hit our pry, but then we end up getting the instructions for that drink. And then if we want to exit, we can do so pretty readily. So I think that's all I want to touch on for right now. I think there might be one thing worth mentioning here. Let's see, we can get a drink by its ingredient. That's cool. We can get drink details. We can Okay. So one thing the last thing I want to touch on just for this part of the build is that what we want to start being able to think about is like the efficiency and performance of our applications, right? Just like if you're working with a scraper, you don't want to scrape the same page multiple times. You want to get what you need on the first pass. With APIs, like you don't necessarily want to make that API call more than you need to because it's going to slow down your application, right? So as far as what we're doing on this line, like we might find that the user is kind of repeating themselves as they use our app. So like, for example, if I go ahead and run our app here, let's say I use honey, right? And let's say I want to look at that first drink, honeybee. If I go ahead and circle back and I want to see that item again, so in this case, I think it was the first guy, right? I've already looked at that drink, so I don't want to keep like making that same API call for that drink. I've already gone through the work of, for that particular drink, hitting my API, getting the data for my JSON, and then setting that attribute, right? I don't want to do that again if this has already been set. So one thing I can do is just make sure that like, hey, I'm only hitting that API if this current drink doesn't have that instructions attribute set, right? Because if it already has it set, it means I've already made this API call for that drink, right? And this is kind of a nice thing to show off when you get to your assessment. It's not something that they're necessarily looking for, but it shows that you're being really thoughtful about your application and what functionality you're building and why. So here we're just going to say something like, hey, go ahead and hit that API for this particular drink right now if that drink's instructions don't exist, so if they're not already set. You also could say something like, unless they do exist. It's the same idea, but we're saying, hey, if this attribute has a truthy value, right, don't do this because we've already set that attribute. I'm going to go back with the else. Sorry, with the if, because I like that better, right? So then what I want to show you, right, is like that actually does something. If we run our application and we repeat ourselves again, right? So if I go with honey again and I look at that first honeybee, I'm going to hit my pry this first time, right? Because that's the first time I'm hitting it for this drink on this round of my application, right? So like if I run a new application, it's kind of starting fresh, like every time I do that Ruby bin CLI, or Ruby bin drinks rather. Ultimately, we'll build projects where we're making use of a database so we can actually store that information, but here it's kind of like every time we run our application from scratch, we start from ground zero, so to speak. So here, this is the first time we're hitting the API for that drink. I'm going to exit out of that. We're back inside of our loop, but then I'm going to repeat myself. I'm going to try to access that drink again, the same one. That was the first one. And we'll see, like, it gives me its details, but I don't hit that pry again because I'm not making that API call again, right? So that's kind of the important piece there, only making sure we really hit that API if we need to. And I think that's where I'll stop from here, right? So this little bit that we built here is almost like a fully working application that would pass the project assessment, right? Obviously you can't use this domain model. You can't use the drinks DB API that I'm using or its sister one. So we can't use the cocktail DB. We can't use the meal DB because it's structured almost the same. But that aside, this is a nice sort of breakdown of how you could structure your application, right? So you want to ask yourself like, hey, what do I want to build? What do I find interesting? And maybe even a good place to start if you know that you want to use an API is just Google like fun free APIs and find one that's related to something you're interested in, right? It's a little bit easier to approach it that way to get the API first based on your interests versus like having this idea of an application you want to build and then now you're hunting and pecking for like an API that may or may not be useful in that goal. So just an idea, take it or leave it. And again, this is a sample project structure, right? You do not have to build a full gem if you do not want to for your project. You can build it very simply the way that we did here, and that's totally okay as far as the project requirements. Just as far as what we've built so far, right? So again, we've got all of our executable done. There's not too much there, right? We talked about the shebang line last time, requiring our files. I thought I fixed this last time, but I'm gonna refactor this here since I'm on. This is totally fine. It's just convention to do it all on one line. So to make your CLI instance and then call that instance method on it. That's a little bit more conventional, so I would encourage you to do it that way in your project. We also talked about our different classes. We've built out our API that handles dealing with like calls to and from our API. We've got our CLI, which is how the user is presented with information, how we get information from the user. And we just about have that fleshed out. We've got some helper methods that just print details for us. We've got a helper that lets us prompt the user so they see that listing again and again. And then a couple other pieces here that we'll flesh out next time. All right, cool. Right. So just as you start thinking about your applications, think not only about what you're interested in, but how you want to build it. You might find that scraping can be a little bit more challenging. It's very, very picky. It can be hard to parse through all that XML data that you get back. API, like building an API can be a little bit easier. It can be a little tricky at first, though, to see how to engage with the API that you're working with. So using an API can make things easier, but the general project structure is not going to change too much either way. So hopefully this is a nice little intro on how to get started.